that they could tell Pacific Islanders that they were welcome to come to Queensland, that they would be paid as farmhands. But when they got there, it was essentially servitude and essentially slavery. The term used for this phenomenon was called blackbirding. And it was quite widespread in some of the farming areas of Queensland. And it, like I said, it was, not quite slavery, but essentially amounted to the same thing. But by 2007, 2008, the government of Queensland, which at that time was a Labor government, came to an agreement where students that graduated from high school in Tuvalu, if they wanted, had the option of coming to Queensland, enrolling in a college, a trades college, to learn a trade. And upon graduation, they were given, they were put in a citizenship track while they were going to school. And once they were working, they had the option of bringing their families from Tuvalu to Queensland. And so that was intended as a way for residents of this particular island that is essentially doomed, that it's unlikely that that island will be habitable a few decades from now. I mean, no one's really certain because we don't quite yet know the extent of rising sea levels, but certainly it will not be able to support a population of society in the way that it does now. So this methodology, I think one of the more interesting parts of it is that it allowed for migration from Tuvalu to Queensland to be decided by the families themselves. If the old folks really wanted to stay in the island, they had that option. But if other family members, younger or older, whatever generation, wanted to migrate to Australia, they had at least one person who was anchored in Australian society, was working, and could sponsor other family members. So that's kind of depopulation over a period of time, but leaving it up to the individuals. So I thought that it was worth mentioning that now or this afternoon, because I haven't heard much of it, of that phenomenon, since I've been back to Canada, which has been more than 10 years now. Except just in the last couple of weeks, there was a news story on CBC Radio saying that the Australian government, so this is the national government, also a Labor Party government, and I should say that the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, was someone that I spent a bit of time with while I was living in Sydney. At the time, he was the opposition critic for transportation. He lived in he represented a riding in Sydney. It was kind of a bit like Leslieville, a kind of relatively well-off, relatively progressive neighborhood. And I had more than one long conversations in his office, feet up on his desk, talking about climate change, what the causes were climate change, fossil fuels, what Australia had to do to protect itself in terms of adaptation, and we did have some discussions about the Pacific Islands. So fast forward 12, 15 years later, Anthony's now the Prime Minister of Australia and has just widened this agreement with Tuvalu, allowing people to settle anywhere in Australia. Now, whether or not that is going to be extended to other islands, we'll have to see. But and whether or not other countries will make that offer. So, one might expect that New Zealand would make an offer to some of the Pacific Island countries. New Zealand is actually I think it has, I forget the term, I think it might be called a mandate or something, over the Cook Islands. So I visited the Cook Islands in 2009 in one of the Greenpeace ships. And the police in that island are all New Zealand federal police, and there are some other ties between the Cook Islands and New Zealand. But the Cook Islands does have its own government, its own prime minister, its own cabinet. But one has to remember, though, that these national governments are very, very small. So the population of some of these countries might be 10,000, they might be 20,000, maybe they're 40,000. So you can imagine operating as a national government with that small population base, with that small a tax base, and especially when many of the residents are living a subsistence lifestyle, very much like I was describing earlier, relying on fish for protein and planting crops on small plots of land. They're not generating a lot of tax revenue with that level of economic activity. So the tax base for these countries is tiny, but not only do they have to offer all level of services at the municipal or provincial level, but they also have to act as a national government and be represented at the United Nations and in regional forum. And the reason that I was in the Cook Islands in August of 2009 was that Greenpeace was working to get the 21, 22 countries of the Pacific Island region to band together and defend themselves against Australia and against New Zealand. And the reason I say against is that those two essentially Western countries were putting pressure on Pacific Island countries not to vote in favor of dramatic climate change at what was then the upcoming COP Committee of Parties, COP 15 in Copenhagen. You remember that was a big one. There was a lot of expectation that strong emission standards reductions would be agreed to in Copenhagen. It was not. The votes weren't there, and it wasn't until 6 years later, the 2015 COP in Paris, that we agreed to essentially, net zero by 2050. That was on the table in 2009, but was rejected. And what was happening was that Australia and New Zealand, Australia had a Labor government, and at the subnational level, they'd made this deal to bring Pacific Islanders over to Australia, but they were putting pressure on those countries not to vote for deep emissions cuts under threat of losing their foreign aid from those two countries. So those two countries were threatening to withdraw foreign aid in order to keep the status quo of not really having serious emissions reductions. So those are kind of some of the politics that are going on in the South Pacific, and I thought I would recount those in the context of climate forced migration.
Thanks so much, Steve. I really do appreciate the walk down that history of the COP and the other pressure going on. And of course, Tuvalu has been in the news a lot recently. I think there's portions of some of those islands that are less than 100 yards wide now, with the encroachment on their coastlines. And the Fiji, there's been in the news, like just as you said, where families are now in dispute around the remaining agrable land on Fiji in a lot of cases. So appreciate your uptake. So Sarah Shartal is going to join us now. Sarah is an Israeli expat, war resister, and is a semi-retired lawyer who represents people with mental disabilities, people threatened with eviction, the homeless, and the poor. And she's going to give us the legal basis for refugee status and for migrants. Now, Sarah, do you want me to put up first the definition?
Yes. Please, thank you. Okay, how do I get this to, oh, I see there, got it. Okay, folks, hello. Now, in order to understand the way Canada deals with migrants and refugees, we have to go back to World War II. At the end of World War II, there were over 1 million people scattered mostly in Europe in camps, although there was one in Mexico. And the various countries wanted a way to determine which people they were going to accept and which people they were going to force back to countries of origin. These are people who did not wish to return to where they came from for whatever reason. Now, what you'll see here is part of the Geneva Convention. There is a sub-convention, which is the Convention on Refugees. Now, the definition, if you look at the definition there in Article 1, it's a definition. You're looking at the end of World War II. It's real simple. You're looking at people who are displaced because of race, religion, nationality, specific reasons in the context of survivors of a mass war. Now, the UN signed that agreement, right? Now I can't, can we go to, you look.
You want me to put the Canadian definition down?
Yeah. Now we're looking at the Canadian refugees. This Canadian refugee law, wait a minute, back up.
Yeah, no, sorry. I just was trying to make sure what I had there. Sorry, apologize.
What the Canadian law does is it refers directly to the convention. Now, let me, for those who are not lawyers, understand how international law has no enforceability in domestic law unless it is directly referred to in a piece of domestic legislation. Okay? In all of Canada's legislation, all of it, this is the only piece of legislation in Canada that directly refers to an international convention. Others will refer to things like international conventions, general, vaguely, or things like that. But this one directly adopts what was in the Accord from Geneva. Now, the reason this is important, it means that Canada refuses to change and will refuse to change the Canadian definition, which is the UN's, until the UN's definition is changed. Now, oh God, I hate this. Okay, let's go to the objectives on refugees. What this means when you put it through. Remember the International Convention? There had to be a specific reason you were a refugee, and it had to be defined as one of those reasons. Now, can anybody tell me why that's a problem for people fleeing because of issues generated by the climate?
It wasn't included.
You got it. More than that, unless they are directly after you by some factor, you don't get status, refugee status. So that I have done some refugee cases, and in one case, the original decision says, yes, it's likely if you go back, you'll be killed because it's a very violent place and there's a war going on, but they're not after you. It was just a general, which is why they put in the specific exception for the Ukrainians. Because simply fleeing war does not get you refugee status.
Mm.
Remember those 1 million people in the camps? They didn't want all of them. They wanted only a very limited number of them. They wanted to force all the others back. So you're talking about the great powers after World War II, acknowledging they have to accept some people, but also trying to make sure they don't have to take all that many people. Everybody else has to apply as an immigrant, because now, other than, who else isn't included? Stateless people. All kinds of other people who are not in official tracks with official status of why you're there. Okay? Can we take the next one on complexity? Now, this is not the only barrier to climate. I'm calling them refugees because in any common sense of the words, you're coming from Guatemala. You can't, you can't grow food in Guatemala anymore. So you're coming north. Think about what Arizona would look like if it didn't have electricity. Okay? That means there's no water. There's no way to live. That's what's going on in various parts of Africa. There are both wars that are driven by climate, and then there's just, you can't live there. It doesn't support life anymore. Now let's look at the next page. Now complexity. Document number 2, David?
Oh yeah, sorry. Hang on a second. Sorry, everybody.
No, that's actually number 3. 2 is the complexity one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't save that. Sorry, Sarah.
Okay, so ignore this one for a moment. We'll talk about the complexity one in words.
Okay.
To apply for refugee status, you have to fill in an application form. Where can you get the application for? You can get it online. Does anybody already see the problem in this beginning of the application process?
Mm.
You're in North Africa, you're in Guatemala, you're in a place that's falling apart, and you have to get the application. Pramila, I see your thumb going up and down. I can't hear you.
Oh, no, I agree to what you're saying.
So the first thing is you have to get the application, okay? So we're through to that. Then there is, you have to fill it in. What does that presuppose? It presupposes literacy in English and French. It presupposes a pen. It presupposes all sorts of things that go into filling in a form. Then you have to mail that thing to Canada Immigration. There's no refugee person you're standing in front of. It's where you can go and say, help me, I have nowhere to go. That's not there. Okay, then what else do you have to do? You have to do a certified medical exam. Again, presupposes that you can get the medical exam, that medical exams have to be paid for, that there are doctors around you, that it's safe to go outside and go somewhere. You know, I was wondering at one point, not that I'm proposing that Palestinians should leave their land, but how the hell would you do that in a place that no longer has functioning hospitals? Okay, so that's first. Then you need photographs of you and whomever is coming with you, and you need 2 copies. So you have to, you'd go through this. Then they really would like some kind of proof that you're from the country you say you are, like a birth certificate, a passport. Again, you can think about all the ways that, and the barriers go on and on and on. And if you don't complete the paperwork, if you don't send in the forms, if you don't have the doctors process, people don't finish the application process, therefore the application is deemed abandoned. Now, what this does, in the most cynical of ways, is it cuts the claims for refugees around people coming from relatively developed rich countries. And it means that failed states, chaotic places, places where more brown people live than white people live, you are much less likely to be able to apply from abroad. Now, there's another category. Those are the people who get here. Canada, other than the US, has no natural borders. So we'll deal with the US in a minute. Everywhere except the US, how do you get here? You don't come by boat, you come by plane. Planes are now under an obligation that if they accept somebody onto their plane who doesn't have the correct documentation, they have to pay for the sending of the person back to their country of origin. So the fact is, the first question is who gets on the damn plane and who gets here? And then there is a separate process that has all those documentation for people who get off planes. But you can see how the refugee system itself, the immigration system has more barriers. We're not going to look at that right now, but the refugee process.
And if you could just draw to it, because we
Yep.
want to make sure people get a chance to contribute to this conversation. And we still
Then
have Chris to talk as well.
Then let's go to the US. Now we'll see the last one, David?
Yeah.
The one you had up before, if you could put it back
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the third party status. It only exists with the United States. It's the only border we have, right? Now, because they were worried that people were beginning to go through the United States and come into Canada, they passed another piece of legislation which says this does not apply to you. You can't make an application if you are a citizen of any other country other than the United States, if you're coming across the border. You can't do that at the border. You come across in some other way, but you can't claim refugee status if you are from anywhere other than the United States, or you are a stateless person. So if you're the Guatemalan, if you're the Nigerian, if you're coming from the Pacific Islands and you have a passport, you cannot cross the border by land into Canada and apply for refugee status. They will simply ship you right back to the United States. It only applies to the United States. They've deemed the United States a good place, a safe place for refugees. Therefore, you go back there, you make your application there. Now, all that reinforces the cutting of the cutting around those refugees that people are willing to claim. So you've either got the people who somehow got here and make application, or you have the people that Immigration Canada chooses from the existing UN camps. Anyone who's trying to go I don't know why they call it the informal refugee process, but it means that anyone who is fleeing because of climate, who cannot live because the air is too polluted and it's killing you, or any of the above, cannot claim refugee status. And it is double enforced because it's not simply a matter of we have to change our definition. That until the UN definition is changed, Canada will not change its definition because it is signature to the original document from 1951. That's the legal status for refugees. So what people try to do is to fit particular cases into those categories, which, as you can see, is often a hit and miss process.
So,
But it means that we really don't support refugees. It just isn't there.
listen, I'm going to just stop you there, Sarah. You can comment
That's it.
later.
That's the end of it.
Do appreciate your providing us that background. And now we're just going to have a voice for migrant workers of somebody who's been involved with them for a long time. And Sarah, thank you so much for that explanation. Now we're going to hear from Chris Ramsaroop. He's been working to complete his PhD at UAT while his research examines the role of resistance by migrant farm workers in Canada. Chris is an organizer with Justia for migrant workers that has been organizing migrant workers for almost 20 years. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks
For joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And since I know, I think all of y'all, or most of y'all, how y'all doing? So I guess what I'm going to say, I'll be brief as I possibly can. I'm going to talk about a couple of things in relationship to what I'm seeing. And then, I invite conversation. The way I'm going to try to think about the role of climate migration is a couple-fold. Through the idea of a nexus, right? A nexus between immigration laws, but also through health and safety, EI, and what happens when people are coming up to Canada, particularly through guest worker programs. I'm going to start off with a kind of a how, like everything else, every other analysis. And I'm not, definitely, I know there's a lot more expertise in the room than me, but how I come across things is usually through an accident. So whether it's the recent DNA victory with a racial profiling incident with migrant farm workers, which we could talk about a little bit later, or other aspects of my work, or my activism, it's been through accidents, right? Where we try to then develop some type of understanding, then that becomes some type of analysis around this work. I'm going to talk a bit about the three types of theories around climate migration. And for us to appreciate that it's not really one theory competing against another, but kind of how they interconnect with one another. And then look at the role of guest worker programs today. And so in relationship to understanding climate migration. And so by accident in 2017, and you know me, if anybody knows me, I'm a kind of a lazy student, shall we say. And I still owe papers for my PhD. But one of the papers I was working on in 2017 was looking about something that was happening real time. As Brother Kid had mentioned, I've been now 23 years or 22 years since I've been organized with farm workers. And, you have to build long-term trust relationships with people and try to understand where people are coming from. And through this longer relationship, I'd met a group of workers at this really, really crappy farm. And what a lot of people use the guest worker programs, as you know, workers are tied to an employer. There's no ability to stay in Canada, very limited access to entitlements, always a constant threat of being sent back home or not being able to call back the year. The way that employers use the guest worker program, particularly the farm worker program, is to try as engaging in multiple labor pools. So you would have this one particular farm, a group of Trinidadian workers. When they start standing up for their rights, engaging in wildcat strikes, they get rid of them. They bring in workers from another country. And that's been happening right from the beginning. And it's happening as of a couple of weeks ago. So this farm that I got to know had a group of Trinidadian workers. They got rid of all of them except for the two favorites of the boss. They brought in a group of workers from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, predominantly workers from Dominica. And this was 2017. Hurricane Maria had really hit hard the country. And the workers were basically told by their families that, Dominica is like 90% destroyed. Hundreds of people are dead. And there's nothing here for you to come back. We want you to try to stay in Canada to get something to do, right? You need to get some money or somehow to continue to work in Canada. And both presenters prior to me have talked about the limitations. And when you're on a temporary work permit, such as a work permit, such as a farm worker permit, once your permit ends on December 15th, you can't find any other work. You can't get a visitor extension. You cannot apply for EI. So in effect, you're screwed. So these workers were really put in a really bad position. They didn't know what they were going to do. Would they basically stay in Canada to be undocumented, go back to a country where they're not going to have anything to do? They were able to get, in addition to some of our advocacy, we had gone public with this case and said that Canada needs to start thinking about, Hurricane Maria, environmental degradation, aka, in relationship to climate change, the way that immigration laws screw over particular groups such as farm workers. And working with FCJ, they were actually able on December 18th of that year to get something called a temporary resident permit that did acknowledge the environmental degradation and the conditions they were going back home. And for us, that was one of the first times we ever saw it. And I think, this advocacy was important for that to happen. To be clear, this was one particular group of workers. This isn't this larger systemic changes that we need to get done. Now, that also brought me into trying to figure out these larger issues once again, these tied work permits, no ability taxes, permanent residency, your indenture to your employer. So thinking about this long-standing analysis that's happening, but also think about this larger framework. What are the reasons why people are coming to Canada? How does colonialism and this export dependency relationship that exists force people into positions of coming through migrant worker programs? And this started leading us into trying to understand this bigger analysis of the way that people are trying to engage in climate migration talks. First and foremost, through Trump, and Trump was very good at talking about this, is securitization of borders, which means closing borders as much as possible to prevent people from coming, the so-called hordes of people from the global south, very much closing borders. Canada, of course, takes a very similar position, even though we try not to think about that. So that's number one, securitization of borders. And Carmen Gonzalez goes through these three different types of theories, or three types of frameworks. So closing borders. Number two, accepting the most exceptional people through humanitarian, compassionate, or particularly refugee claims. So the HNC or refugee models, but as Comrade Shartal said earlier, that people coming through climate migrants are not really seen to be either one of these characters, right? So humanitarian, compassionate, or refugees. It doesn't acknowledge it currently. So you have to be kind of creative in understanding that. Canada recently announced that they're going to accept about 5,000 or 6,000 people from Central America. I don't think they've used the word climate migration. I think they've talked about war and economic circumstances, but I think it's also understood that some of that may be related to climate refugees or climate migration issues. However, the kicker, and this also starts back from our previous presentation about the Pacific, is what we're seeing, through the World Bank and other avenues, is that peeps are seeing the role of guest worker programs. And they're seeing this as a win-win situation to address people leaving the global south as a result of climate change, to come to the global north or the South Pacific, like Australia or New Zealand, to engage in work as a result of what's happening in their own home countries as a result of climate change. Now, it's defined like the way we define temporary foreign workers today, as a win-win situation to, one, address labor shortages, and also to ensure this idea of climate resiliency, or ensuring that people who can't find work as a result of climate change can find just work in places like Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. But for all of us who have a very critical analysis, there's a couple of things for us to think about. How do we define labor shortages? Number one. And number two, what type of work are people actually coming to do? Now, if you've seen Statistics Canada, the most recent data around the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program in the agricultural stream, there's a couple of things that should be screaming at us immediately. That number one, greenhouse production has seen an extremely large rise over a couple of years. So overall, we have about 70,000 workers that are coming to all the different streams of guest worker programs in the agriculture and agri-food production. Most of it, as all of you might know, is for export production, or it's extractive. So greenhouse production is not, or tobacco or ginseng is not for local consumption, as the industry likes to produce or say, but it's really about an agricultural industrial complex, about exporting to the United States or to overseas. So, and as we all know, the type of industrial agriculture is also very harmful to Canada and to our lands as well, too. The other really kicker about this stuff is the industrial meat production. So whether it's beef, pork, or chicken, this is where we see numbers skyrocket. And they're also, and we haven't seen the exact numbers of where people are coming from, the bases. We know that Canada, Jamaica, Mexico, and Guatemala are the largest countries that are bringing up workers. But I could also assure you that when we look at the smaller numbers or the increases we're going to see from Central America and South America, in relationship to climate migration. We know that both the United States and Canada are trying to push people to come as guest workers who have no ability to engage in democratic participation, access and claims to social entitlements, and once their work terms end, return back to their home country. So very much circular migration that doesn't address the crux of the issues and basically force people to not really address the climate migration issues that are happening or this larger economic dependency that is a result of colonialism. Are you all okay so far?
Yeah, that's great, Chris.
Okay. So this is what's happening, but also getting back to what's happened in the last couple of years. So we've seen the forest fires in BC, and y'all get a chance to read my article in Briar Patch. It's a lot more, I think, nuanced than what I'm presenting here. And it comes from, as I said, many years of failed writing. But what was really important for us to understand from that are some of the peeps that I've met, right? It's not about what I bring to the table, what the farm workers from themselves, what they're saying in this beautiful piece. And, just having to work in British Columbia, particularly cherry workers or blueberry workers working during the heat of the fires, right? So whether they're working at night and having to deal with the smoke or working the day, imagine having to, work within those fires. Well, I can't. Oh, thanks, brother. Thank you. So, the blueberry workers, the cherry workers, talking about the actual impact, right? How people were fainting, the impact it had on their health. And the fact that, and I know that Nick and others here will talk about the health and safety component, right? The fact that our health and safety laws are not there to protect workers in general, but particularly agricultural workers who are excluded from health and safety provisions, many aspects of health and safety provisions. But also the fact that climate change is not incorporated in any type of health and safety laws. So on one side in British Columbia, we saw that was happening. Here in Ontario, and in some of my other presentations, some of my brothers and sisters have provided video of what is actually to work in a greenhouse and how hot it gets, right? And seeing the way that intensification is happening on the outside, but what's actually happening in the greenhouses where workers are fainting. And one of our brothers basically shows himself in there. He takes off his first shirt, wrings it, and you see water. Then he brings it again, the second shirt, and it's like it's like a bucket of water, right? And that's how hot it gets in there. And remember, agricultural workers do not have additional breaks. There are currently no heat stress rules. There's no paid time for when you're sick. There's no real right to refuse work. And there's questions about the water that is being provided to workers. If it's greenhouse waters, that's really nasty water, right? This is not clean water that's provided. So, heat stress laws are not really applicable. And there's, of course, a constant threat, as mentioned earlier, about reprisals for standing up for your rights, which has happened many times. Also, what we're seeing as a result of these large forest fires or also other climate change conditions here across Canada or the United States is that when workers are losing their livelihood, farm workers have very great difficulty. If not, in many cases, they cannot access EI benefits. So you've got peeps who are not able to work because of the tied work permits, and they can't get access to EI because of these tied work permits as well. And in many cases, when your work permit ends, you can't get access to anything. So our social entitlement system isn't basically set up to help workers who are faced impact by climate change as well, too. Now, as I said, we've got to start looking at these larger dynamics. I've talked about the way that industrial agriculture, export-oriented agriculture, particularly meat industries, has increased our use of guest worker programs. But we're also seeing trends across the United States. And I also want you all to watch what's happening in Israel. I think that's really important for us to understand where other dynamics around guest worker programs are going. So keep an eye on what's happening, the narrative of what's happening in Israel, and the way that they're looking at the arrival of migrant workers in relationship to Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very nuanced conversation that I think we also need to look into relationship what's happening here. The United States just actually announced last week that they're going to be expanding, actually doubling their H-1 program, so in the hospitality and service sectors, to address workers from Central, South America, and Haiti. So they're planning to bring in another 60,000 workers from the area. And while it's not overtly said, this is another way of trying to deal with strife related to climate migration as well too, through guest worker programs as well. So I think Canada and the United States are looking not as a humanitarian approach, but in the interest of industry, extractive industry, to keep increasing numbers of people. So on one side, about challenging the way that people are coming through the status quo, the fact that people are not coming with the idea of permanent status on arrival, the way that our health and safety laws, workers' compensation laws, EI laws don't work for workers in general, but also particularly this group of workers, for climate reasons. So thinking about this dualities from a worker's lens and from a migrant lens and how they intersect. And lastly, the future. So what is the future? How do we address this stuff too? So I talked originally about the 3 themes. And what Carmen Gonzalez and other people have talked about is, if workers and if migrant workers themselves had the ability to dream about what climate migration looks like, they'll talk about autonomy. And that means how do they develop policies here in the global north, but also give policies in the global south where they can have the right to remain and all the right to move as well too. What I mean by this is, it's the global north that's driving the industry lens. The global north is driving the immigration lens and the migration lens. But what if people from the global south actually had the ability to say what they actually wanted done? How does migration look for them? How does internal and external migration, and what are the compensation or the reparations that are needed to take place to compensate communities that have lost their livelihood as a result of practices here in the global north? I think I'll leave it there. I'm sure you've got lots of questions and critiques, and I welcome to hear anything.
Chris,
Thanks.
thank you so much. Sarah, thank you so much. And Steve. But what I'm going to do now is I really appreciated people paying attention to these 3 wonderful presentations. Sherry, I'm sorry, I didn't see you in the waiting list room until Nick mentioned to me. Sorry, it didn't come up on my screen that you needed to get in. I really do apologize. But I'd like to turn to everyone. We were going to go into smaller groups if numbers behold, but I really want to engage people in this conversation. So first, the question is your own experience of climate migration, or what you think of it, because it's the 2 things. Some of you probably actually have some experience of it in your lives, or some of you just may have some thoughts around the Steve, Sarah, and Chris presentation. So please just give us your thoughts on those 2 questions. Climate migration, what does it look like in Canada going forward? It's always the hardest part to break the ice at the first person. I do know this one. Claire, you got your hand up there?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I probably won't stay in the conversation.
Not to worry.
Because a lot of things I heard, I found a bit, I couldn't really agree with them. And just the basic thing that I'm looking for is what needs to be done to get prepared for more people to come for that reason. It sounds like it's something at very high levels. And I firmly believe that every country has a right to protect its borders. We can't just have anybody coming into the country because we can't cope with it. So I think I wouldn't be on the same wavelength as anybody else.
Would I?
Well, hang on a second, Sarah. I do appreciate your honest response, though. Appreciate that. And thanks for sharing with you on that. And you share that with lots of people and all over. But we're trying to look at a different conversation here.
Yeah, but I don't mean it in it. I mean, obviously, I feel concerned for people that are not going to be able to stay where they've grown up and where their roots are. Yes, I know that we have to cope with this going forward, but I just cannot relate to statements about economic dependency and colonialism. I mean, it's not my experience in my life as a person born in the West, and I don't like that. So
thanks.
I think I better leave. Okay.
So I know Sarah was going to add something, then Chris, and then Nick, but we want to keep going on to other speakers.
Absolutely.
So Sarah, please keep it tight.
Yep. Look, for Claire, this is the question that I asked people who today we can't accept. No one who is coming because of climate can be accepted in Canada. There's no category average. So the question is, if you want something between completely open borders and a hermetically closed border to anyone that is not explicitly chosen, what would be your criteria?
Well, I wouldn't
I
have it
just
just
think
off the
about
top
it.
of my head, obviously.
No, I'm not asking you to. This is
but
what I think we need to talk about is,
yeah, clearly Immigration Canada has to get to grips with this, and so does the UN.
absolutely, but the
Yeah.
question is,
So
what are the criteria?
as
Mhm.
opposed to a
Yeah.
dialogue between you and Sarah
Okay.
with Claire, I think Chris wanted to get in and Nick wanted to
Thank
get in
you.
as well. So
Claire,
Chris,
before you leave,
get in there,
before
Chris.
Claire leaves. Oh, wow.
Oh, did
Uh,
she go? She went. Okay, go on, Chris, and then Nick.
Yeah, I think it's, important to engage in a bit in these conversations, but it's also, we can't shy away from the racism of Canadian immigration. And I think that, the seasoned agriculture worker program was built as a form of racism. Look out, we've got something coming up around EI in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye on that. I want you all to also check the Hansards. There's a way that we talked about white European farm workers versus Black workers in the 1950s and 60s. Canadian Hansards, from the immigration minister, the oppositions, everybody said that we could never bond a fellow white European to a farmland. We cannot control the movements. We cannot be a country that denies fellow Europeans the rights that each one of us has. And that was the 1950s, right? And in the 1960s, we saw the emergence of the farm worker program, which brought up Black workers, and they were denied the basic rights and provisions that Dutch workers, Polish, English workers received beforehand. So very much our immigration laws have been very racialized to control and to contain movements of people. And I know some people may not have, may find that controversial, but it's basically the way that we've seen. I think very much our conversation today with Ukrainians versus other communities and how our immigration laws have been developed has shown a differential treatment of groups. And today these are the reasons why migrant farm workers still cannot live here as equals. They cannot apply for permanent residency. And we define them as groups as who are non-immigrant related. So very much race has been built into our conversation about temporary foreign worker programs, who's skilled and who's not skilled, who faces further restrictions and who doesn't. And furthermore, it's going to basically connect and intersect with climate migration, right? Who we see as deserving and not, and who we're going to be excluding through this idea of securitization borders.
Yep.
And Nick, did you want to get in this as well?
Well, I had wanted to speak to Claire because I think the question she raises is an important one. And, but I'm not sure she understands what the future holds. And I thought that, I think she excluded herself when it wasn't really necessary to, and I was going to speak to her about that.
Yes.
Because within the way things operate now is one thing, but we're facing a massive increase in migration. It is going to be a major global crisis. It's already starting to be, but it's going to get worse and worse. And that's the context in which we should, I was hoping that Claire would be willing to engage in a dialogue with that. I think she should have to exclude herself from this discussion, but that was what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, thank you. So back to others. I mean, again, I did appreciate her honest and her frank, and it's too bad we didn't go dig into it deeper, but I'm just looking to others who have joined us today. Any other commentary on how things are in the world right now that you're aware of in terms of climate migration right now? A number of you have had experiences in other country or even in your own community. A city like Toronto is a reality almost every day. Okay, Pramila.
First of all, I really want to thank all of you so much for new information, old information, which was refreshers, and your passion of the work which you do. And Chris, hats off to you once again. I'm thinking aloud to say that in the last 5 months, it is who they are, whether they're international. I'm talking about Toronto streets, which we all share. The number of young, sick, turbaned young men and women Some of them may be international students, but most of them are on work permit for 2 years. And because some of it, because of their youth, they're dealing with such adverse living and working conditions. It is absolutely horrific. So what I'm saying is that the programs which the government makes, because we want our mean age is like 40, 50 or some whatever, we don't have a tax, the people are retiring, we need young people to do warehouse jobs and retail and all that very, very crappy jobs. What is the thinking behind it? Is that we are creating a reserve army of labor force by way of just creating a very, very awful, and it is very deliberate. So whether they're farm workers, whether they're sort of international students, or whether they're Uber, and their treatment, and their sort of, people are looking at them in subways, on streets, and on the GO train when the vendors are using their bicycles. There is a kind of, it feels, I've never witnessed this in the 40 years I have been an immigrant here. So I'm just putting it out there to get a better understanding of what we can fight for by way of having humane policies in this.
Thank you for that, Pramila. Marilyn McKim. And you're on mute, Marilyn.
Is Pramila, are you waiting for an answer?
Oh, sorry. No. Well,
No.
I think so. She just was contributing.
Okay.
No, I'm not waiting for an answer. I just put it out. It's the question is too vast.
Well, I don't know if Chris has some thoughts about it.
I'll wait. Maybe we'll take the question. I do have a few thoughts, and Pramila, sending you a big hug. I'll let you guys go, and then I will the questions, and then we can answer afterwards.
Okay. So I'm a member of Amnesty International Canada, which for a long time has had a great refugee rights program. That's one of the organization's priorities. But of course, climate refugees are not included in those that we try to protect. I'm also part of a small group within Amnesty Canada, the Climate Justice Advocacy Team. And our little team has been trying to get Amnesty Canada to include climate refugees by pressuring our international office to name them as equal in need of protection as refugees coming from persecution and fearing for their lives. Same vulnerabilities there. Mm-hmm. But from what Sarah was saying, nothing's going to change until it changes at the UN.
Yep.
So my question to Sarah is, do you know of any efforts to create that change in the definition of refugees to include climate?
Thanks, Marilyn. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Basically, answer is no. That the focus at this point in general advocacy around the UN is on the standards for emissions, things like that. The environmental movement as a whole has not addressed the problems of climate migration. Climate refugees, particularly if we think about, realistically, as Nick thought, and I know I was told not to, at this point, the UN estimates that there are 200 million to 300 million climate refugees at the moment. Now, the issue of the convention from 1951 exists in every European country. The way they dealt with Australia is they have a separate act called the migrant law, so that no country in the world at this point accepts refugees from climate. No one, zero. My sister, who lives in France, talks about the Mediterranean being a graveyard for a river of people. Now, let's look at Canada, because I want to just briefly for Pamela's. There are multiple groups in Canada of international people who are brought here under different programs. We know somebody died from sleeping outside in Hamilton. But let's look. We know we have the nannies, for whom, at least in principle, there was the ability, if you stayed long enough, to get status. Then you have the international students, who are interesting because the universities need them to continue to function. They are all overwhelmingly from Asia and Southeast Asia. They are the only group at this point in which anybody's trying to improve their conditions. They are also the richest. They work shitty jobs when they're here, but somebody was able to pay their tuition. Somebody was able to pay for their airfare. So yeah, they pay enormous amount of tuitions, and yeah, excuse the language, they're treated like shit in terms of being able to work. But the fact is, they are so profoundly different than the migrant workers, or the nannies, or the Guatemalans who are sleeping on the border in the United States. So when we think about climate migration and climate refugees, class and race cut through that problem. We have the program for the Ukrainians, and it was funded. But we don't have anything for Central Africa, where 1.1 million people are on the edge of starvation because of climate change and the wars. And the moral question, which is the one I would ask Claire, which I think we all have to deal with, we really have two choices. Either the world finds a way to redistribute people, or we accept that millions of people will die. There isn't really any middle ground that I can see. Now, in Canada, it's really interesting the way they reinforced the 1951 convention, which at the time was a good thing. But the unwillingness internationally to update it and change it is, and I'm only speaking for myself now, I believe, because they know that if they change it, the doors become very wide. There are a lot of refugees right now. And people hide about calling them migrants. They're not migrants, they're refugees. They're leaving their countries because they can't sustain life there. But it is a question that we have to at least think about.
Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. Sherry Hillman.
Hi, David. Yeah, I just wanted to comment briefly on Canada's racist immigration policy. I've been living a nightmare for the last 2.5 years trying to get my granddaughter and my daughter-in-law to Canada from the Philippines. And first of all, they turned down a visitor's visa, saying that basically they thought she was a liar. She wouldn't leave when it expired. And this is somebody who's actually married to a Canadian. Her daughter is a Canadian citizen. We've got her citizenship certificate and her passport. And it's been a 2.5-year nightmare, and it's still not over. So, and we've got 2 lawyers working on it, excellent, wonderful lawyers, one from Ecuador, one from Mexico. After I almost had a nervous breakdown, despite being a paralegal and, having some skills in this area. It's insane what the Immigration Canada's website is like. And anyways, I'll just, I feel like I'm just venting, but, the policy is absolutely racist. You look at when there's a political reason that the Canadian government wants to let people into the country, they can expedite it. Look at what happened, with the Ukraine. Look what happened in Hong Kong with dissidents. So it's a political agenda that the Canadian government uses their immigration policy for, not for humanitarian, based reasons. And with the Philippines, one of the pressures that I feel really strongly is they've always been susceptible to really horrible typhoons. And with climate change, that's just getting worse and worse. And, rising sea level. My daughter-in-law and son built a place on a small island, Marinduque, but, it's about, 3 meters above sea level. And where we live in the winter, Cozumel, our house is about 5 meters above sea level. And, people are getting really, really concerned. People here are used to hurricanes. Almost every year you get them, and they've learned over the years to build the infrastructure that's necessary. But what's happening this year is with that horrible hurricane that wiped out Acapulco, you've got mass unemployment. So you've got that migration right in Mexico. So all the people that work in the hospitality sector are, coming to the East Coast, to the Maya Riviera and Cozumel, and places where they can find jobs in that field. But it's going to really drive up the unemployment rates and make things hard. So everybody you talk to here is really, really worried about that. And I have a lot of friends who've been trying to get visas to get to Canada. And the only thing that they can get is, seasonal visas to go, temporary foreign worker visas. I think it's just flat out racism. And the government could do something more if they wanted to, but there's no motivation, and it just seems to be, I'm at a loss to know how to put pressure on them to, be more humanitarian. And right now, they should be opening the doors to Gaza and letting in, people could even get out, but on the news all you'd see is a concern for Canadian citizens or permanent residents stuck in Gaza. But you think about the other 1.5 million people there that are just being slaughtered, and government policy, of course, is just not dealing with any of this. Anyways, that's my bench.
Thank you, Sherry. So I'm going to go to Nick, and then I just, Lynn, Lee, Jerry, Susan, if there's anything you guys wanted to add. We're trying to, don't worry, Sarah, you're going to get in there. But no, stop, Sarah. We're trying to get, Nick was in before you, please. You've had a lot of chance to say some things. Nick, you're up.
Well, if there's other people who haven't spoken, want to go ahead of me, I'm fine with that.
No, I think you're up if you'd like to. I'm going to make sure that Sarah and Chris get a chance to come back in, but I just wanted to encourage others to get in if they wanted to. That's all.
So I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but it with what I'm going to say. But so what becomes clear is the racist policy around immigration reflects a general problem with how Canada relates to the world and our climate policy, because the climate policy does not recognize the severity of what is to come. It looks mostly at what may or may not happen to us. But Sarah put it well in terms of the globe. this is going to become much more major than it already is. And so the question is, how do we reorganize the global population when a good part of the globe is going to become unlivable? What are we going to do about that? What's our responsibility around that? And secondly, the right wing, what are they going to be doing in that period of time? They're going to be building the anti-immigration sentiment and are already around the world, again, especially in Europe and United States and Canada, and that is going to affect the politics of society in general and how we're able to deal with the climate crisis or not. So I guess the question I'm raising is that how do we begin to talk? And I think that's why I wanted Claire to be part of the discussion, which is how do we talk about this problem? What's coming? What's it going to mean? I recognize the problems exist already, but it's going to be much, much more severe. And what's our responsibility in that? What do we do about it? So I think that's something we need to find a way to talk to people about, because there will be people who will react to migration without thinking beyond the sort of the immediate problem as they see it, not understanding the real fundamentals of what's going on.
And listen, Europe, there's many countries over there that are shutting the doors down for years now. As Sarah said, the Mediterranean is a river, and if you follow some of the latest reports, what they're reporting is where the migration is going to. Because it first was trying to cross the Mediterranean, then it was going to different parts of northern Africa, and now the latest report came from the Canary Islands. Like they're trying to find a different access point because of, and again, the current Prime Minister of England, his main policy to try to get reelected is not only to shut the door, but to actually throw out of England a number of people who are there on a temporary basis. So, Lee, please, Lee, thanks for joining us in this conversation.
Yeah, he wants to send them to Rwanda.
Yes, he does. Yes, you're right. Absolutely.
Well, what Nick just said undergirds the importance of SCAN doing what it can with respect to climate change, but that's not going to happen in our lifetimes. I'm particularly happy with what Sarah presented. I've lived through some of it. I know who the stateless people are. I just want, because it's so immense and complicated. And the other thing I would say, I got an important call, Chris, and I had to take it. So I missed part of what you said. I want to share a lived anecdote, if you will. I've been involved through the church as a sponsorship agreement holder with sponsoring some people who can be termed refugees, even they're originally from Palestine. Their grandfather was chased out in 48. If they ended up in Lebanon or Jordan, they'd be stateless, but they ended up in Libya, and we know what happened in Libya. So they were regarded as being eligible to be considered as refugees. And during the COVID times, it was complicated. But IRCC did apply itself over time. We've succeeded in having 20 members of 3 families come to Canada. Their brother, who was already here, has been immense in raising the money and helping them settle. And now they're all productive. They're all contributing. So the students have part-time jobs. The person who doesn't have much English, he's in construction. The mother who was a teacher of English in Libya is now working at the YMCA, etc. So that's the anecdote I'd like to share. And I guess there weren't any racial implications in the acceptance of such folk.
Thank you.
We did it, is my point. We didn't run into that kind of obstacle.
Absolutely. No, listen. Thank you so much, Lee. Now, before, I think what we'll do, because I usually find that there's only a saturation point where, and Sarah, you don't put your hand up. You're going to get recognized to conclude, you and Chris. But I do want to ask everybody in the room, Lynn, Lee, Jerry, Marilyn, Yvette, I guess that's Alan, Susan. Are you willing to come back for another session on this topic? And Premila, can you show by your hand whether you'd be interested in coming back to another meeting on this topic another time for us to take it further, or what SCAN could do around this? I always find that, it's a good background, good conversation we started with today, but I also feel that at this point it's Lee, would you be willing to come back again to a conversation on this? What SCAN could do on this matter?
Well, it's so huge, and we have to try, but how would you define what we would specifically try to do? Or is that going to be the subject of the next get together?
It could be that, but there's, like, the world is your oyster in terms of, as you know, in terms of getting that family in. Sometimes it's basically that, but it could be bigger things about pushing changes in policy. It could get encouraging people to have this conversation. There could be any number of things. There's a lot of different aspects going on now. It's the issue in Toronto is just trying to get people housed in the current, a lot of migrants who are in our midst. The fight is even just to get them housed, but there's all sorts of things we could do on a policy level. But our SCAN, reference point is always around the climate, right? We're trying to at least connect it to that. And so, anyways, I'm just trying to encourage people to let me know if they'd be interested in coming back again. Lynn or Jerry, would you be interested in coming back another time on this conversation? Lynn.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in coming back another time. I'm not sure what I have to offer. I come to the call knowing very little about this. I had sort of a vague awareness, so I've learned a great deal today, which is maybe reflective of many people and speaks to the need for getting just word education out. So certainly I'd be interested in coming back. Yeah.
Lynn, and listen, the best part of what you just said was the honest approach. And I don't know anybody in this room who didn't learn today from all the contributions that were made, particularly by Sarah, Chris, and Steve. Jerry, would you be interested in coming back again? Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to always, as an organizer, just trying to keep us moving. That's all.
I can only watch what you're doing and listen. To me, it's all repeat.
Okay.
Yeah, you're just repeating, trying to get through, but I don't believe that we can get anywhere as long as we have people that make donations that are called lobbying, and we allow that, but it's really bribery, and unless we can stop that, we will never have democracy.
Okay, no, appreciate your contribution, Jerry.
You can try all you want with all that other stuff, walking on the streets and everything, but as long as those donations are coming in and thwarting every election, thwarting everything that we do, we cannot stop that unless we register all those donations and make it public and know where it's coming from, and then start working on trying to get power over that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jerry. Susan, are you interested in continuing this conversation at another time?
Yes, I would. I mainly came to find out more about the issue because I am aware it's a huge problem, and I was hoping to get some idea of something that could be done. But it looks like at least the first thing is to find out more about the whole issue, and then maybe something will come forward. At least sponsorship seems to have worked, yeah. So yeah, I will come back as long as it's at a time that works for me.
Of course.
But even then, I can read I love reading what you post. So even if I can't come back, I really appreciate the minutes and stuff on things. So that's good.
Oh, thank you for that, Susan. I will, by the way, share. Chris mentioned the article he wrote in Briar Patch. I'll make sure that gets also distributed to everybody. It was a very helpful piece. And again, just before I go to both Sarah and Chris to ask their contribution for things that we could do. Pramila, would you interested in coming back? Putting you on the spot.
No, I mean,
Okay, no problem.
yeah, to understand, for me, I mean, I'm a sort of a lifelong learner, so I'll just keep on learning. I don't know. I get also very defeated with actions which are for 50 years of my life have really gone the dodo way, except for very small victories here and there. I can count them on my fingertips, 4 things which I may have succeeded in my participation succeeded in, and that also was total accident. So, but it has still not made me a cynic. I'm skeptical and will keep on learning, and any forum which teaches me, which I can learn from, I will do it. So David, there you
So
go.
I will send you the invitation and then you can decide. Marilyn, would you come back again?
I think the question that might be most compelling to not only us, but other SCAN members are the ones that Nick and Sarah framed for us earlier in the discussion about whether, for example, we open our borders because of the need, or we accept that millions of people will die. I think it's a question that's very useful for us as human beings and as people living in Canada to ask. Whether we can do something about it, I don't know, but solutions come from these kinds of dialogues. So who knows?
Well, no, thank you for that, Marilyn. So listen, I'm not trying to just, drop the ball on everybody, but we always try to, with the idea of having the session today was to move forward in terms of what we could do. So I'm now going to finish with both Chris and Sarah for them to make conclusionary comments to hearing what they heard people say. And also they may have suggestions themselves for what we could do, but I just figure, and then I'm just going to finish with a couple of words and that'll be it for today. But we've got everybody's name from today, and we really would like to continue this conversation because we do believe that this is an important area that SCAN could make a contribution to, because there's few other organizations that are taking this on. So Sarah, if you want to start, and then we'll have Chris, do you have some comments?
Okay. I think there are 2 things that we could do as SCAN that might actually affect things. It was taken by what Lynn was saying about Amnesty. Am I right that it's Lynn who's from Amnesty?
Marilyn.
I think that if we're talking about what we're capable of doing, is if we can organize people and environmentalists so that we can get petitions with thousands of names asking that the issue of the definition of refugee, of migration, be included in the dialogues around the COP meetings. If we can do that and put pressure on those who will actually be there to acknowledge that this has to be talked about. The definition has to change because every country accepts the definition. And if we could try to forge, there are groups here and there that raise the issue, but if we could focus on the international issue so that we can get an international recognition that climate is causing refugee flows, not just UN declarations, but we've got to deal with it. The other, and this is actually speaking to Sherry, one of the things that in Canada, we're so good at it. And Chris, you've seen it with immigration and a lot of others. We often in legislation have a lot of rhetoric, but the real question you're asking is about access. It's denial by process. In law, it's called bureaucratic disentitlement. It's an actual legal term. And I've litigated it a couple of times, but it's interesting because I won't go into the development, but I think we have to look not just at how the definitions are, but demanding things of the Canadian government in terms of access. Why do Canadian embassies not have a refugee office? Let's get to some of the really practical stuff. Why is it so hard to get an application form? Why if you want to open the doors, you got to have someone to be there. And those are things that I think if you raise in public saying, have an office in every consulate, have a photocopier. Photocopiers are good. I remember listening to a translator from Afghanistan. He was working for the Canadian government. I've worked on a couple cases of those, but he was just on the news. He says, look, they keep telling me, I need to photocopy this and I need to photocopy that and I need to take it to the consulate before I can get on a plane. He says, I'm in the north. I'm in my house. I can't go outside. Where am I going to get a copier? And how am I going to get it to Kandahar so I can get on the plane? You officially say I can come, but you say I can't come until I've given you all this stuff. Those are often where the issues around race and class and access get cut, because you cut. So background as an academic, it's called the uptake rate. What proportion of the people who should be applying, even under our miserable statutes, actually manage to get the application done? That's also something that I think in Canada, people will see as profoundly unfair. Those are things that I think are practical.
No, those are two perfect practical suggestions. Chris, any suggestions you can make to SCAN about how we can improve the situation for climate migrants?
So I'm going to be a couple minutes. I want to start with the most practical. So right now, the province of Ontario is looking at regulations around heat stress. Yep. I think that's really important for people to do submissions, to do protests, to do call your MPPs, and to ensure that climate change is considered. There's also is a climate change. The province.
Time out, Chris.
Sorry.
Are farm workers included in that reg?
Right now, it seems there will be.
Okay, sorry. I just needed, because every time I've asked that, it seemed to be for workers in factories and offices, but I didn't know if farm workers, sorry to interrupt you, but I just needed to maintain that farm workers are included in that.
No worries. It's an important question. So yes, farm workers, ag workers are included. Yeah. However, it is not what we want, right? There's no additional breaks. There's no strengthened anti-reprisals. But I think it's important for people to start bringing these issues forward. The province of Ontario is also looking at, and they haven't figured out, but they want to do some action on climate change under OSHA as well, occupational health and safety, I'm sorry. I think we need to look to Washington State and California to see some of the protections they're providing for farm workers and other workers, and look what's happening in British Columbia. There might be some points of where we need to do stuff. If you're looking at EI issues, it's making sure that our EI system, protects all workers, period. And whether you're on your tied work permit, you're undocumented, you're precarious, that you've got access to EI. So these are kind of run-of-the-mill things that all of us need to think about. I'm going to push you all to start thinking about the portability of rights. So OSHA, OSHA is also Ontario, or Canada, Occupational Health and Safety.
Different name.
Sorry?
Slightly different name.
Well, it's pretty much the same, right? Under the Ministry of Labor.
Yep.
So what's important for us to also to think about is, how pension, CPP is something that people can get overseas. We should be ensuring, especially if migrant workers are coming to Canada, that such rights such as EI or other rights should be portable, so they can get workers in Canada or in their home countries. Some of you might think that's controversial, but the reality is, do you know that Canada and the United States have had agreements since World War II? A portability agreement around EI. Do people know about this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so commuters who work in Windsor, live in Windsor but work in Detroit or vice versa, Canada, United States has had agreements since World War II. And we're saying that, we've already have agreements in place. We could develop very similar mechanisms when workers who are working for decades here should be having access to EI, right? So those are three, I guess, basic things. Getting to Pramela's point about international students. I don't know for y'all, but I find it quite hypocritical that we keep saying we're in a housing crisis, yet we've got such a financialization, such a wealth gap. There's so many people who have second, third houses. There's so many places that are empty, yet so many people can't afford a place to live. That, for me, I think is a contradiction here and the crisis, that we've got such a disparity between who's got this power and who doesn't. Now, I want us to go back, and I know most of you were active in the 90s, the Harris era. And what are the two things around post-secondary education that happened? Was it the federal government, Paul Martin, cut the benefits and the transfer payments, and the provincial governments led to the privatization and deregulation of university fees? And this is kind of the crux of where things started with the expansion of international students and the privatization of a lot of secondary schools, post-secondary schools. So it's not just saying that the international students are a phenomenon and to be blamed, which seems to be this larger discourse that's happening, but going to the roots of underfunding of our post-secondary system. I think it's critical for us to understand what's happening here. And the fact that you've got students from India, for instance, who pay, I think, more in money than what the government's actually providing. That should be a crisis for all of us. Some of you might also seen the news, right, where international students are being blamed for food banks. Which I think it's a heresy in itself that we should also be looking at too. So I'm getting at, let's look at the roots of the post-secondary education crisis and to better understand the crisis that international students are happening right now. On one side, we can't blame them for paying $60,000 as some of my students are paying to be a student in my class. And then say that, they are not facing they're not facing poverty issues here, right? So I think there's that as well. To the question around what will right-wing governments do, remember to those three kind of paradigms I talked about earlier. What we will have is more people coming on temporary foreign worker programs when the conservatives get in power. Very much the liberals and the conservatives haven't, their analysis and the way they engage in stuff is not very different. What we have to be concerned with the expansion of TFWs is that people are coming under the status quo. And let's think about this as a democratic disenfranchisement. When more people are coming up as guest workers, they can't engage in democratic engagement. They can't be involved at municipal levels around housing issues, provincial levels around labor reforms, or the federal level around immigration reforms. So I think that's one of the things that we've got to think about. The more people that are coming up as guest workers or tied work permits, is a threat to our democracy, right? When people cannot engage through different forms. It is a legal framework to disenfranchise multiple people who are impacted. And I want us to also think about the idea about, our two choices about expansion, millions of people coming to Canada or closing the borders. Let's also think about what reparations or what we need to do, since we are the ones causing, us, the United States, the global north, are causing most of the crisis right now in the climate change. What can we do to invest in countries of the global south to ensure that they don't face the impending crisis? What steps can we be done rather than reframing and reinforcing the neoliberal agenda that currently exists? The last thing, just the privatization of immigration is something I need to flag. And while there's definitely important stories about sponsorship, we also have to see that there is a way of privatization of our immigration system. Rather than the state having responsibility to be expansive and to develop a immigration system based on humane and fairness, what we've done, in fact, is listen to employer organizations, privatized responsibilities, and put the role onto people or the private sphere, rather than the government basically being responsible for our immigration system. So rather than simply saying sponsorship and saying that people should be responsible, like the great work that you're doing, why is the state reneging on its responsibility to protect communities, right? So I think that's something for us to have an analysis about. It's a tough conversation, but it's also something that, I've had to think about a lot over the last couple of years, particularly with private sponsorship programs. I think that'll be it for me.
Chris, thank you so much. And listen, Thank you so much to Steve Shallhorn, to Sarah Shartal, and Chris Ramsaroop. Let's all give them a warm scan. Thank you. And really do appreciate it. And I'm now going to make one last contribution for the end of the session today. And this is from Robert Hicks, who is a member of SCAN, who has actually written his own ode to migrants and refugees. So it's just another contribution. And I'm just going through the end of this poem that he's written up, and it's on the SCAN website. When hunger, conflicts, and climate change combine, the numbers of migrants will grow, and thousands more will then be seen in cities where they've never been. Year by year, day by day, there will be telling when crops will die, homes will burn, and roads will flow away. Today, our aim must be to pave a way for empathy, to build more highways of hope, to be ready to help the displaced cope with equity, equality, and dignity. These terms can be used interchangeably: disaster refugee, climate change migrant, environmental migrant, climate migrant, environmental refugee to be. To help them all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights must never grow old, never erode, must never melt, shrink, or fade. It must not fail. It must prevail. It must stand the test of time. This was Robert Hicks' contribution to our conversation. And thank you. And I only read the last half just to sort of keep everybody's attention. But listen, thank you all for your contributions today and your participation. We will, after even me pointingly asking you, I will send an invitation to the people I've asked who said they would be interested, and those who are hedging on it a bit, because I do think that this conversation is pretty important, is essential for us to continue and for SCAN to contribute to this contribution as well. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, David, for taking the lead on it.
Not to worry. Well, as we did in the Climate Justice Committee today, everybody, thank you so much again. Bye, everybody. See you soon.
David, can you stay for a sec after?
I can.
Thank you.
Is James still there too? Good.
Yeah, he is.
Thank you, Gail. That's Robert Hicks right there.
Okay, cool. Just a short bit, two short bits. First off, I really did need that thing that you didn't add. It would have made it shorter.
I understand that. I'm not convinced it would have been shorter, but I understand. I didn't see it in the things you sent me in the last.
I did. Well, anyway, not important.
And you're claiming you sent it. I didn't see it. So I will go back through the emails you sent me. And again, as you know, I was trying to always, as you could hear from the people who participated, I think for them, it was more the issue in general and the barriers as opposed to the details. So
no, the barriers are because what's happened in immigration.
You don't need to explain it to me now.
The barriers we can't see, and people always feel bad about. Like I feel.
I understand that, but Sarah, you know people who are still starting to understand an issue. If you go into the too deep in the detail, they don't get out of the weeds.
No, I get that.
And that was what was happening today with a number of people for their first. It was amazing how many people it was their first time.
Yeah, and it's amazing that the fact that immigration is so central to Canada, and yet people know so little about it.
Absolutely.
Now, the other is just in terms of, I think when we do the next one, it would help me at least if I had a separate standalone invitation, not as part of a bulletin, but as something.
I understand that. We did it that way so that it went to all SCAN members.
We can send.
But next time it's going to be by invitation only to our people. This is my attempt to build the Climate Justice Committee in a different way.
Cool. But
getting new members.
For sure. Because I do believe that I think what Marilyn pointed out is really interesting. And if we could generate petitions to, we have to decide which organizations, and have thousands of people saying, when you talk about this, please add this, we need somebody to And the
I would
other,
appreciate you first, and I'm going to ask you to do this first. Find out if it exists anywhere else right now.
I've been looking for it. I'll just say
I understand. And
I-
and you know how these things go. It takes a lot of work to do that, but I would go and check England. England always seems to have more of these things than us. If your sister in France knows of one, I'm just saying.
doesn't, because we've looked.
And again, in America, I always find America in Washington City, there's always something like this.
The interesting part in the
Or
UN,
Chicago.
I'm just saying, I've looked, they haven't actually looked at the UN declaration. There are
Right,
books that work on immigration,
correct.
but the idea of expanding the mandatory definition of refugee,
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody
No,
understand.
no, you stated that, and I'm just saying if you could look again,
Well-
because I don't disagree with you, or I know you usually check these things to attend, but I just want to
I'm-
make sure we leave no stone unturned, right?
And it actually, her question astonishes me,
Yes,
because the fact that I couldn't find it, it like wasn't emblazoned on,
yes, yes, yes.
you know, with everything that's hitting Europe, the fact
But-
that, you know,
But maybe the place to start is to actually have a conversation with Marilyn about what Amnesty has done on this.
because I went through all
Because
the,
maybe there's a reason why Amnesty isn't leading that.
I don't know, but I looked through the.
That's what I'm suggesting. So maybe you
And I
could
looked through the
start with that.
Greenpeace
Have a
website.
What's that?
I also checked all the Greenpeace, the 350s, all of that. The directly confronting the definition of refugee in the 1951 convention,
Right,
because every government in Europe is using the same thing.
right. No,
And
you
they've incorporated it in legislation.
yes.
I will, but it's an.
No, I'm just trying, I mean, again, it's as opposed to we just have the conversation again and say, I just don't like, if there is anyone anywhere that we can learn
will
from.
Do my damnedest.
And James, what did you think?
Well, I think that we can progress to the point of determining where SCAN fits in all this, and whether we can develop some sort of strategies to change what's happening. Because we're not going to see, well, I guess the sad part is if you look at our immigration programs now in Canada, we're failing. We're completely failing.
Yes.
People are homeless and they come and they don't have places to stay. All this stuff needs to be sorted out. And I think that's probably the sentiment that we heard in the meeting, was that people are resistant to opening up our borders for that very fact, because we don't have the services to provide to
Yes.
other people, like the way it's currently set up anyway.
I
we
did love
certainly
that
do-
woman's bluntness, eh?
Well, no, but I think her sentiment is pretty general in society.
It is.
Unfortunately, that's the
It
reality. Is people are saying, well, shit, we can't even take care of our own. Why the hell are we going to bring in more people? And I think that's even portrayed in our media. So I think that there's a whole a whole discussion that we need to have as SCAN members, because this is going to be a huge problem, as Nick pointed out. I mean, we're going to have 200 to 300 million. We probably have 200 to 300 million now, but what's it going to look like when we have 1 billion or 2 billion?
No, it's true. And this could be a chance to connect with all those other organizations that are out there that know about this in another sense,
But I think that our group as a whole, if we look at it,
Yeah.
we're virtually white. We're fairly, we're fairly well off in comparison
Yeah.
to other people. So I think it's going to be hard for our group to digest how important this is, and that we can actually play some sort of part in that. And I think we need to play a positive part. And I guess it's going to be more. I think we need to develop a strategy meeting. I think it's the next one as
Well, and that's what I'm going to try. But for us, are you guys willing to meet on the 1st of December? That's a Friday. So it's not next Friday, but it's and so with that one, we'll plan the next session of us again. Okay.
Yeah,
And then
that's-
'cause we should, unless we just schedule another meeting of the people who came today in just,
January.
sorry, say that again.
Mid-January.
Okay, I was gonna try to just to leave, get I was gonna try to do it sooner than that, just to keep the iron rolling, just to at least touch
Just
base
make
with
it
people.
Crazy.
Well, yeah, but there was only 20 people
Okay.
there today.
Okay. Then,
I will suggest some dates back to you guys by email, okay?
So we don't know of any organization that's actually working on this directly.
Well, that's why I was asking
I
Sarah,
will make some
and
look-
I'm gonna look into it as well.
the places that I would find most interesting, where we have the greatest comparables,
Hmm.
are rich countries that have no migration borders.
Right.
Because the question which is in Canada, and I think it's reflected in part in Claire, is that the country's never been confronted with the question around mass immigration because we don't have any borders people can get here. So the places, I was thinking, I hadn't checked the Scandinavians.
Right.
Now, it was surprising to me that I couldn't find it among the English with all of this, but it's like it's two separate worlds.
Yeah, no, I would have thought the English would have something because they have a ton of these little NGO organizations working away on this.
Didn't
On a
find,
side note, I was just I had to leave because there was a red-tailed hawk out there again and eyeing the dog.
Wow.
So somebody was talking about birds down at
Yeah, that was Yvette.
right? So we're not far from there, but there was a hawk out there, I guess probably eyeing birds and stuff, but I was worried it was gonna fly down and attack the dog or something.
Well, no, it's important to save the dog because now the eagle has taken the dog. Anyway, take care of you guys. I'll see you soon. Wonderful
Sounds
job,
good.
Sarah.
Take it easy.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
and thank you for keeping me shut, because the question around the rage I feel when it's even what we've got is fake because of bureaucratic disentitlement.
I understand. I mean, we just got to keep moving. That's all. Anyways, take care.
Bye.